Today's daf we're going to learn is Eruvin Samach Daled. We ended yesterday with this story, which we're going to continue with for a little bit, which is this person, Lachman Baristak, who lived in a courtyard with other people and other Jews, and they wanted to do an Eruv, and they were stuck because they wanted to rent from him, and he was unwilling to rent them space. So Abaye said, this is what you should do. Remember, he suggested, why don't you make one person, right? That he said first, let's make only one person the owner of this courtyard. Everyone will be mivatel their reshut, which is something you could do generally when Jews live among each other and somebody forgot to be part of the Eruv. Usually it's just kind of one person saying, oh yeah, I forgot to join the Eruv. You can use my house. So let's let everybody do that. Then he'll become one person living among a non-Jew, and that will be fine because we already said there's no gzera in that case. Again, holding like Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov. But then they said, but what do you mean? But the whole idea was to have the Jews not living with the non-Jew, and here they're all living with him, even though they canceled their reshut. It doesn't really work. So we said, so why don't we just say though, if everyone cancels their reshut to one person, that's already a very rare circumstance. And again, in rare circumstances, the rabbis didn't make their decree. So that's what Abaye suggests. But the story continues. Second to last line, the last word on the second to last line of Samach Gimel Amud Bet. Azal Rav Huna bered Rav Yoshua Amar l'shmate kamei de Rava. So Rav Huna bered Rav Yoshua goes and he tells Rava what Abaye had said. Amar le, Rava says to him, Im came bitalta toat eruv me'oto mavoy. Well, in this case, what's the situation? If they all cancel their reshut and you don't need an eruv, then you're going to end up with this courtyard where there's all these Jews living, but there's no eruv, and then people are going to forget that there's such a concept of eruv to begin with. So that's not a very good thing. So what does he suggest? Well, Dima Arve, listen, let's make an eruv, even though they don't really need it. We'll tell them, number one, cancel your reshut. Number two, put an eruv there. And that way, people won't forget that there's such an idea of eruv, that you need to put food down so that everyone's together. So then they said, well, that's going to create confusion, because if everyone canceled their reshut to the Jew, and he really is kind of like the sole Jewish owner here, with a non-Jew, what are they going to think? If there's an eruv there, right, put two and two together, they'll assume, well, if everyone canceled their reshut, then, and there's really only one Jew, and there's the non-Jew, must mean eruv mo'il b'mkom nechri, that an eruv works for a Jew and a non-Jew, and that's not true. You can't do that. So it's going to cause some misinterpretation. So they say, no, we'll make an announcement about it. And every time they do it, or I don't know exactly how, we'll start announcing it. Now, we all know what happens when that happens. So they announce it the first year, the second year. By the third year, they don't announce it anymore. They figure everybody knows. So what does he question? He says, Achrazata l'dardike. What about the announcement's not going to help the children, because the children don't pay attention to the announcements. They don't understand what's going on. And when they grow up, they're going to always remember that, it's interesting. They'll know that everyone canceled their reshut to one guy, but they won't know that the eruv that's there, right, is really for the Jews and is a sign, but not for the non-Jew. And they'll just remember, oh, we did an eruv with a non-Jew. They'll move to their own houses, their own communities. They'll start doing eruvim with non-Jews, and they'll get totally confused. I actually read a great thing this morning, one of these Daf Yomi groups on Facebook, about somebody wrote, Miri Galper, and her name is, she wrote that this is a good example of this year where in the holiday season, a lot of people cut out lots of prayers, and they changed the services in order to allow for shorter services to endanger people's lives less, which is very logical, makes a lot of sense. But she said all these kids are growing up with, this is what they're going to remember, and they're not going to remember what used to be, and again, I guess it depends how long this lasts, but that there's a danger of children. I was thinking about it that, there's the little kids we were talking about the other day walking, they don't understand that people don't wear masks in normal life, right? We're walking around with masks all the time. And some of these little kids, 3-year-olds growing up, they think that that's their world. It's very crazy. So this is where you see how children, their perception is different than ours, right? And they don't understand the background. They don't have the knowledge. So it's going to be dangerous. And you also see that this is also very classic, you do something and you start doing it one year, and when the decision is made, everybody's involved and they understand the reasoning. And then over time, people forget why we even started and why we do it in this way. And then, so if you do something unique and very detailed, oh, well, it's okay because of this, that, and the other thing. Eventually people don't remember this, that, and the other thing. And then, they don't even, and this, by the way, is a lot of how minhagim developed. And things happen and things end up kind of off track sometimes because of this. El Amar Rav. So basically, Rava keeps suggesting these suggestions. Rav Huna Breit Rav Yeshua keeps saying, no, that's not going to work. So El Amar Rava, Lezal Chaminayu Li Karev Le. He says, I have a better idea. Why don't one of the Jews start becoming friendly with this Lachman Baristak? V'lishol minei duchta. And then he'll say, can I borrow a little space in your house? V'linach beimidi. Listen, I don't have enough storage space in my house. I want to just, can I just put my table in your house temporarily? Can I leave it here? And then if he does that, it's a little surreptitious, right? Become friendly with him. And then, it's like a little, but okay. And then then you become like a hired laborer or a gatherer, someone who gathers their crops. Afilu lakito notain v'amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, and Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, afilu sechiro afilu lakito notain eruvo v'dayo. They made a special dispensation that if there's someone, now a hired laborer, when a hired laborer comes into your house, they don't own your property at all. And when a gatherer, someone gathering your crops, at least you could say usually they got paid by eating the crops. So they have a little bit of, connection to your property. But a hired laborer, much less so. But they made a special dispensation that afilu schiro afilu lakito can put the eruv, they can function on behalf of the non-Jew, but not even on behalf of the non-Jew. It's like they own part of the non-Jew's property and they can then join the eruv. Remember, the non-Jew can't join the eruv. So here the Jew ends up kind of saying, oh, this is really my property. And he can join the eruv for that property. Now, this is very strange. I see him wrote in the chat, and this is what I wanted to discuss. First of all, wasn't there a gzeira to prevent us from living with non-Jews? So why are we coming up with these leniencies? So I think that what's going on here is that, again, we talked about this the other day. Not all non-Jews are evil people and out to kill us and have bad actions that we're going to learn from their actions. So it's possible that as time went on and the Gemara already in Babylonia, they had very good relations with the non-Jews and people were living among them and it wasn't teaching them bad behaviors and all that. And it could be at that point, they couldn't get rid of the halacha that the rabbis earlier had determined, but they could find ways around it to basically make it more feasible. So I think that that's really what's happening here is that they're trying to find a method for how we can allow this because really it's not such an issue for people to be living with non-Jews. And therefore they're coming up with ways that once someone's working in the non-Jew's house, then already they can join the eruv on their behalf. The other thing I was thinking about the hired laborer having ownership rights in your house, I was thinking, I have a cleaner who comes to my house. So she comes in and she sticks her bag right in the middle, like as if it's her house. Like, oh, while I'm here, I can put my bag wherever I want. Like she doesn't ask me, where would you like me to put my bag? She just puts it down, and I thought that that's maybe a good example of when someone comes into your house. So they put their stuff down and they basically, for the time that they're in your house, they kind of, right, that's their space, right? No one else uses it when their stuff is there. So I think that that's a good example of why a sechiro and lakito can theoretically be considered as they have rights to your property. So now we're going to see something interesting. Amarle Abai le Rav Yosef. So based on the sechiro and lakito halacha, Abai questions Rav Yosef. He says, let's take this one step farther. What did we learn? If you have a courtyard and 5 people in the courtyard and 4, all Jews, and 4 Jews join the eruv and 1 doesn't, remember that person messes it up for everybody else. So here comes Abai and he says, if you're going to say that sechiro and lakito means that they have rights sort of in that property and they can use it. Again, what did we say? We said, well, one of the Jews should just go be his friend and put something down in his property. Say, can I use your property for something? And then he's not a hired laborer and he's not gathering any crops, but he has a deen just like that. And that law, Shmuel had said, it works. So let's do our situation like that. Now, Abai is asking Rav Yosef about that law itself, about a sechiro and lakito. He says, Hayusham chamisha sechiro, chamisha lakito. Let's say 5 Jews worked in his house. Mahu, do they all have to be part of the eruv? Do they mess it up for everybody else? If there's 5, once you say that they're owners, well, then if they're owners for the purposes of eruv, then theoretically, each one can, if they don't all 5 join, they're going to mess it up for everybody else. So what's the great answer? Amar le, Rav Yosef says to him, Imamru sechiro v'lakito lahakil, Yaru sechiro lakito lahachmir. The whole thing of sechiro and lakito is just a leniency. We don't have to take it all the way. You don't have to always play everything out to the end. No, the whole idea was to make it easier for people. So we're not going to make it more complicated for people that every single hired laborer is now going to have to join the Eruv. That would never, it would be hard for it to happen. So basically, we're saying, no, you don't need that. Okay, we're going to keep this simple and just as a heter. And this is often you see where when they do something for the purposes of leniencies, they don't take it all the way and also do a stringency based on that. Gufa. Now we're going to go in depth, but not really in depth. We're just going to have a comment somebody made about this halacha. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, afilu schio v'achili l'lukito notenu revo v'tayo. So that's just what we learned. That's the halacha that Shmuel taught. Amar Rav Nachman, when Rav Nachman heard Rav Yehuda say this, he said, Kama ma'al yahashmata. Wow, that's great. That's a great limud, a great halacha. But because he said that about something, we're going to bring something else he said about a different halacha of Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, which he didn't like as much. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, shata revi'it yayin al yoreh. If you drink a revi'it of wine, which is not a huge amount of wine, right, a quarter of a loaf, al yoreh, okay, it's like a small cup of wine. You cannot teach halacha, okay? You can't teach, you can't paskin. No, you're what we call shtuye yayin. This we learn out from the Aharon and his sons are commanded not to be shtuye yayin, not to come to the mikdash when they have drunk wine. And we derive from there, and it says there also that the Kohanim are the ones who teach. So they say also, in those days, the Kohanim taught and paskin. So therefore, anyone who drinks wine also can't teach. Rav Nachman, lo ma'al yahashmata. I don't like that halacha. I don't think it makes any sense. I am not clear-headed until I drink a revi'it of wine. Okay? Now, we all know there's different people who react to wine in different ways. Some people, right, you drink a little bit of wine, they become drunk or at least tipsy right away. Other people, it takes a lot. And he's even saying, it's good for me. Now, you have to remember, that's what they drank in those days. They didn't have soda. They didn't have juice. They had some juices, but mostly what they drank was wine. So he says, I need a little wine to kind of get me going. And that helps me think more clearly. Now, what's the issue? The problem is he didn't really speak very respectfully, right? He said, oh, I like this. Oh, that's a great halacha. That bad halacha. What do you mean? That's not the way you talk about halacha. So now we're going to see, Amar le Rava, my time Amar Marhachi. Why did you say this in that way? That Hamalia, this is not Malia. This is nice. This is Hamar of Acha Bar Chanina, my dertiv v'ro ezonot ya'abed hon. What do we learn from this pasuk? Someone who's a shepherd of zonot, okay, of prostitutes, will lose all his wealth. What do we darshan from that pasuk? Kol ha'omer shmu'a zona'ah v'zo einana'ah ma'abed hona shel Torah. If you say, I like this halacha, I don't like this halacha, or I like this thing you said, I don't like this thing that you taught, that he loses all the wealth of Torah. Okay, some people say this means he forgets his Torah. Some people think it means other things, that he loses the beauty of the Torah. And interesting, why do they compare it to zonot? So I think it's the Meiri. He says that people like to say about women, oh, this one's beautiful, this one's not beautiful, right? It's the same idea. And that's not the way you speak about women, and it's not the way you speak about Torah, right? To start saying, oh, this one's beautiful, this one's not beautiful. That's not the way you talk. It's very disrespectful, right? We always say it's objectifying women, right? It's the same idea here about it's objectifying the Torah. What, like, oh, we could take this, we can't take that, right? And therefore, Amar le, what's his response, Rav Nachman? Hadrebi, I take it back. You're right. Okay, and it's like a big, right? He comes and he says, you're right. I made a mistake. I shouldn't have spoken that way. It's interesting. The daf ends with the issue of nidarim and people wanting to change their neder and how it's bad to take a neder, to take a vow, right? You have to always be very careful how you speak and what you express, because words can be dangerous and words can be effective. And I was thinking in terms of learning, right? Many people are learning Gemara, some people for the first time, and you see all sorts of outrageous things in the Gemara. And if you want to say something's outrageous in the Gemara or it doesn't make any sense, you have to be careful how you say it, right? Out of a place of respect, right? To say, oh, I don't understand, or right, in some kind of respectful way, rather than saying, oh, can't believe the Gemara says this, right? You can't say something like that. That you see from here. Amar Rabba bar Rav Huna. Now we're going to get into this Shatoy Yayin and Shikur. We're going to distinguish between someone who drinks and someone who's drunk. And now we're going to move away from teaching and into prayer. Okay, Daf Mishalahem this week talks about Kavana in prayer, coming basically from this sugya and the beginning of tomorrow's daf. We're going to talk about it also, how you have to be clear-headed when you pray. And then they kind of discuss, well, what if you're not? Right? What if it's hard to focus during davening? You have a lot of little kids running around, and you have a backyard minion, and you're trying to daven, and right. So they talk about the whole situation nowadays about what we're dealing with now with backyard minyanim and kids all around, and how do you focus in davening and how necessary is it? So anyway, you can listen if that works for you. Anyway, Amar Rabba bar Rafuna shatoy al yitpalel v'im yitpalel tfilato tfilah. Someone who drinks shouldn't pray, and if he does, it's okay. Okay, it's okay if you drank some wine and then you pray. Shikor al yitpalel v'im yitpalel tfilato toeva. Someone who's drunk shouldn't daven, and if he does, his tfilah is a toeva. It's despicable. Okay, if you're drunk and you daven, that's really despicable. It's interesting because on Friday night in shul, my husband was speaking dafka about this topic. The Mishnah Brura in Simchat Torah, in his introduction to the parak, he basically talks about the fact that there was this minhag that developed in Chutz La'aretz when basically Shmini Atzeret ends and Simchat Torah starts, where in between Mincha Marav, people would drink. And then the question is, how could they do that if they were going to get drunk? And then how could they daven Marav? So he has a whole discussion about the halachic issues related to it, and it all comes from our sugya here. So it's nice when those things connect. So hechidami shatoi vehechidami shikor. What does it mean to be, right? Where do you draw the line? Oh no, this is a little complicated. Where do you draw the line between being drunk and just drinking some wine? We're now going to have a story about them. And this is just to tell you that one of them explained this distinction. They parted ways on the Nahar, by the Nahar Yupti, on the banks of the river. Amru kochad minan, they each said to each other, Lema milta deloshmi alachavri. Teach me something I don't know. Okay, they said, let's part with words of Torah, and I want to learn something that you know that I don't know. Obviously, how they knew what the other knew and didn't know, but they obviously had to rack their brains to try to come up with something that wasn't the most common halacha. Why did they want to do this? To Amar Mary bar Rav Huna, Mary, the son of Rav Huna, says, Lo yipater adam mechavero ela mitoch dvar halacha. Right? When you part with a friend, you should always part with words of halacha. Shemitoch kach zochrehu. That way he'll remember you. Now, if you teach a halacha the way they darshaned it, is if you teach a halacha that they already know, I'm not going to remember you for that. But if you teach them something they never knew, every time they come across that halacha, they'll say, "Oh, I remember. I learned it from that person." So Amar Hech. So now Patachava Amar. The first one starts and he says, how do you distinguish between a drunk person and someone who just drank some wine? Shatoi kol sheyachol ledaber lifnei hamelech. Shikor kol she'eino yachol ledaber lifnei hamelech. If you would go to a king in that situation, then you're just shatoi. You're just drunk some wine. If you're willing to go and place yourself in front of a king, right? That's always, especially when we talk about prayer, we're supposed to view ourselves as if we're in front of King of Kings. So would you go to a king, right? People like to get dressed when they daven, in proper clothing, wear shoes, right? All those things are part of this idea that you're standing before a king. You wouldn't stand before a king, right, not dressed properly. But the other is, if you wouldn't stand before a king, then, right, we know that people who are drunk, it would be an embarrassment to go in front of a king. When you're drunk, that's when you're drunk. So that's the test for the border between drunk and having drunk some wine. The second one, now we're getting off topic because we're in the middle of the story of the two halachot they taught. The second one says, Patach idach v'amal, hamachzik b'nechsei hager ma ya'aseh v'yitkaimu b'yado. Nechsei hager we've learned before. This is a convert. When a convert converts, it's as if they're born fresh. So even if their family converts with them, they're not considered their relatives. So if they don't have any other children after they convert, then none of their relatives are their relatives. If they die, they end up without anyone to inherit. So their property becomes hefker. Anyone can come and take it, ownerless property. So if I take ownership of ger's possessions, converts' possessions after they die, I basically become, it's wealth I acquire very easily. So because of that, there's concern. Number one, that people will be jealous. If people are jealous, there's always concern. Ayin hara, what ayin hara is when we say bli ayin hara and all those things, ayin hara basically comes from people looking at us with a bad eye, meaning they're jealous of what we have, and that brings on what we call ayin hara, and it makes, there's a concern that maybe I'll lose it. There's also a concern that I won't recognize God in it. I just want all this, then I won't. Sometimes when you work hard for something, you appreciate it. Here, you don't really appreciate so much, and you don't really appreciate God's role in it. So, if you want your possessions not to get lost, what do? Yikach behen sefer Torah. Okay, so you should basically acquire a sefer Torah. What do? You put it into a mitzvah. Okay, and then you won't lose the money easily, because what's the concern? If there's an ayin hara on it, people start looking at you jealous, then the ayin hara might cause you to lose everything that you gained. It's also, people win the lotto, and people always say, often there's people who just don't even know what to do with the money, and they kind of squander all of it. So you have to be careful and put it into something of value. Amar Rav Sheshet, afilu baal b'nechsei ishto. I'll give you some other example. He says, a husband who basically gets married and the wife brings a wealthy dowry to the marriage, all of a sudden he kind of comes into wealth. It's another thing that you have to be worried about. Rav Amar afilu avad iska v'ravach. Even if, here's a good one, you made an investment and it profited, right? Often you make investments. Sometimes you make an investment and you spend a lot of hard work making sure it goes well. Oftentimes you put money down, and right, even in the days of the Gemara, it's interesting, right? So you put money down and all of a sudden, a company goes public and you win a big windfall. So money like that also, right? Obviously not in those days, but Rav Papa Amar afilu matzah mitzia. If you find something on the street, same thing, right? Even that, which might be something small, again, you should put it into a mitzvah. Now we have an interesting line. Why is it interesting? Because it could go in two directions. It's interpreted differently. Amar Rav Chanina, oh, sorry, I skipped the line. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak afilu katav behu tefillin. Okay, now what does this mean? So some people say this is an additional one. Even if you write tefillin, if you remember, we talked about the fact that tefillin were very expensive. Remember, we saw that a lot of people weren't even wearing tefillin. Very expensive. Why? Because people charged a lot of money for it. So that's another example of someone who makes money. Now, it's not exactly easily, but they make more than what they really should be making. Okay, potentially that maybe is what they're saying. Other people say, no. This is back to the first thing. The suggestion was, what do you do with the money? You write a Sefer Torah. So now he says, also you could write tefillin with it. Okay, in other words, another thing, put your money into investing in tefillin, and that's a good way to spend your money. So it's interesting that could go in either direction. Where do we get this from? This whole thing? Dichtiv talks about Bnei Israel when they were in the desert and they went out to war. It says, "Vayidor Yisrael neder laHashem vayomer im naton titein et ha'am hazeh biyadi." They went against Melech Arad and they said, "If you let us win, v'hacharamti et arehem, we're going to put their cities cherem. We're basically going to sanctify them to God." Okay, so here you see. When they came into this windfall, they sanctified it to God as a way of saying, right now you see really the idea behind it is strengthened by this pasuk, one of the options I said before, which is to see God's hand in things, right? If we win this war, we know that God helped us and therefore we're going to give it as a gift. We're going to offer to God all of the possessions that we get from the city. Amarami bar Amma. Now we're back to getting drunk. So this was an aside we got to because of the story of the two people that wanted to part with words of halacha. So now getting back to our situation. Amarami bar Abba, derech mil v'shena koshu mefigin tayayin. Well, now we want to know, when are you not considered drunk anymore? So if you walk a meal, which is, we're going to see a lot of connections, even though it doesn't seem to directly connect to Eruvin, but a meal is 2,000 amot. So here our classic distance that we've been talking about. If you walk 2,000 amot, 2,000 cubits, that basically takes out, right? Take a walk, that'll help you become sober. Or a little bit of sleep. You take a little nap, that'll get it out of your system. Depends how much you drink. Okay, interesting. This is Rav Nachman who came up before, right? Is saying, oh, I drink a little bit and, it's good for me. Interesting. He says this. He says that's only if you drank a revi. But shata yoter mi revi, right? He thought a revi was actually good for you. So it's interesting to hear he's talking as if you need to get it out of your system. I don't know how you reconcile those two. Aval shata yoter mi revi'it. If you drink more than a revi, then you're already so drunk from the wine that walking is going to make you even more tired and kind of feel even more out of things. And sleep is going to also get you much more dreary and more drunk. So that's not going to help. Okay, so we're going to go back to this line later. Right now, they want to question, and for this, we're going to bring a long braita, which we're going to get very off topic and only get back on topic at the end. And then we're going to get off topic based on some of the things that came up in this Gemara, in this braita. So now they ask, "V'derech meal mefiga hayayin?" It's walking a meal. That's what gets rid of makes you sober. V'hatanya, it says in a braita, and we're going to see. I'll just tell you because otherwise you're going to get lost a little bit. We're going to see in this braita that Rabban Gamliel had drunk wine and he wanted to walk 3 meal before he was willing to deal with the halachic situation. So Maseh Rabban Gamliel shaya rochev al chamor. Okay, remember this. This is like, I don't know if you know that famous joke. I like to refer to this. It's you say you're the bus driver, and then, X number of people get on the bus and some people get off the bus. And then you keep, people are trying to follow all the things. And then they say, what's the name of the bus driver? Nobody remembers because that was the beginning of the story. Who paid attention to that detail. So this is a detail you probably wouldn't pay attention to. And in fact, when I read it at first, I didn't pay attention, but you'll see it comes back later. Okay. He was riding on a donkey. So keep that in your mind. He was going from Akko to Achziv, right? Northern Israel on the ocean. Or near the Mediterranean. So he was going from Akko to Achziv. Rabbi Eli was walking behind him. Matzah gluskim baderech. He found some bread on the floor, lying on the floor. Amar lo Eli, tol gluskin min haderech. He says, Eli, pick up that bread off the floor. Matzah nochri echad. While they're walking, they find a non-Jew. Amar lo. So Rabban Gamliel says to him, Magbai tol gluskin halalu me Eli. Go take that bread from Eli. Nitfalo Rabbi Eli. So Rabbi Eli sees something strange. We'll see in a minute what he thought was strange. And he kind of goes next to the non-Jew and starts talking to him, strikes up a conversation. Amar lo, could be they're telling this story also because it's this interactions with non-Jews. And we were just discussing that with the non-Jew in the courtyard. Amar lo mehechanata. Where are you from? Amar lo. Interesting also, we have this connection. First, we have the 2,000 cubits, then we have the connection of the Borganim, which are those huts that they would put up every 17 2/3 to connect cities. So I'm from a city of huts, full of huts. Umash shimcha, what's your name? Mavgai shmeni, my name is Mavgai. So he says, Klumi kercha Rabban Gamliel me'olam. Did you ever meet Rabban Gamliel before that he knows your name? Amar lo, lav. He says no. So Rabbi Eli says, how on earth did Rabban Gamliel know that his name was Mavgai? Right? It's not also the most common of names. It reminds me, I was in Vietnam and 70% of people have the same name in Vietnam. They're all named after, or in certain Arab communities, you have Muhammad, right? There's certain names that maybe Mavgai was like the most common name that they were all named that. I don't know. But anyway, how did he know his name? So, Ba'otasha alamanu shekibem Rabban Gamliel beruach hakodesh. Apparently, he must have had some sort of Ruach HaKodesh that told him what his name was. I don't know what to do with this, but it's interesting that that's what he says. Okay. Now we're going to get to halachic things. That was just an aside that Rabban Gamliel must have been, right? And you see Rabbi Eli is kind of awed by him. Wow, I can't believe you really knew his name. Okay, next. Also, by the way, the fact that the non-Jew didn't remember Rabban Gamliel doesn't necessarily mean Rabban Gamliel didn't remember him. Maybe they did meet, that's also a possibility. But not what the Gemara says, not Rabbi Eli says anyway. And then he says, there's three things that we learned at that time. This is very classic in stories. There's always, Shema min hatzlach. You can learn three things from this story. So here he says, this is what I learned. Number one, if you see food on the floor, you can't pass over it. Meaning, you have to treat food. This is where there's people who don't throw out bread until it rots. There's all sorts of halachot that come from here. You have to treat food with respect. You can't just throw away food. If it's less than a kazayat, then yes. If it's more, then you can't just waste food. Okay, this goes with certain people who keep this for halachic reasons, certain people who keep this for idealistic reasons, which may, I assume are somewhat connected. Anyway, the assumption was that this food belonged to a non-Jew and that it was non-kosher food, right? Now you would think, don't we have to always be machmir anyway and assume it was non-kosher? In other words, he wouldn't let Rabbi Eli eat it. He said, give it to a non-Jew. Because why? Most of the people that were passing through this area were non-Jews. And therefore, he had to assume it was a non-Jew. Now, again, you might say, of course, you can't just assume it's kosher, but we're going to see that there's actually a kula here, that it belonged to a non-Jew. And the third one, the lamanu, we didn't tell you this part of the story, but apparently this was right after Pesach. You can benefit from non-Jews food after Pesach. Okay, this is what we call chametz shavar alav Pesach. If you have chametz that existed before Pesach, are you allowed to benefit from it? So if it's a Jews, there's a whole discussion in Pesach on whether you can, right? You can't eat it. You're supposed to burn it, right? Because you're not even supposed to have hana'ah from it. There's actually a debate about it, whether you can benefit from it or not. But here we learn that certainly if it was a non-Jew's food that he had over Pesach, you can benefit. Where was the benefit? Well, if you give it to a non-Jew, the non-Jew kind of owes you one. So here, he benefited by giving this to the non-Jew. And now you see why it was important to say, because if it was potentially a Jew's, it also could have been potentially chametz shavar alav Pesach, and we don't have to worry about that. And then, you'd have to have burnt it. Okay, the story continues. So the first part of the story, we learn these 3 halachot. You can't walk by food and not pick it up and treat it properly. You follow the ovrei drachim when you're not sure if food belongs to a Jew or non-Jew, and chametz shavar alav pesach of a non-Jew is fine. And that's how we can sell mechirat chametz. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to sell it. Next, so the story continues. He was on his way to Chziv, which I said is achziv in our time. Somebody comes to Rabban Gamliel and says, I want you to do hatarat nidarim, right? We get rid of our nidarim. We do this on, and I'll just remind you, we do this Erev Rosh Hashanah, and when we do it, and we're going to see this in the Gemara, the 3 people who function as the Beit Din, right? It could be also a chacham mumche, which we're going to see Rabban Gamliel functions as the chacham mumche, or 3 people. So normally 3 people sit down and everybody else kind of stands up there and says the Hatarat Nadarim. So they sit. We're going to see that comes from this story. He said, I want to get rid of, I took a vow. I don't want to be in this vow anymore. Amar lezesh imo. So now he says, it's interesting, they don't call him Eli anymore. He says to the one who's with him, Shatinu revi'it yayin ha'yital, klum shatinu revi'it yayin ha'yitalki. Didn't we just drink a revi'it of yayin ha'yitalki, Italian wine? Amar lo hein. He says, yes, we did. Imken, Rabban Gamliel says, Yitayel acharenu ad she'afik einenu. Okay, he's got to walk with us now because we have wine in our system. We got to get it out. So how much would you expect them to walk? A meal, right? Based on what we said earlier. V'tiyel acharehem shlosha milim. He followed them for 3 meal. Okay, not 1, but 3. Ad shigil l'suma shel tzul. Kevan shigil l'suma d'tzul, yarad Rabban Gamliel min hachamor v'nitatef yashav v'yitir lo nidro. When they got to the city, Suma of Tzur, they basically said, okay, we're going to, now we'll sit down and we'll do it. Now, you could claim that maybe you wanted to get to a place where it was appropriate to sit down. Maybe that was the next city. So Julie's saying it's actually Rosh Hanikra, Suma of Tzur. Okay, thank you. I was wondering what the Suma was. I didn't have a chance to look it up. So thank you for telling me. So that's Rosh Hanikra. Basically, he gets to there and, that's really the next settled area. So it's very likely he just wanted to get to a settled area to sit down properly. But let's assume not, because the Gemara assumes not. He walked 3 meal. What happens? So Yarab Rabban Gamliel min hachamor. So he gets down off his donkey. Nit atef. He puts on a cloak, kind of like a judge, the way you would imagine a judge, right? He puts on something to have it more respectful. The yashav, and he sits. That's where we get sitting. The yitir lo nidro, and he gets rid of his neder for him. He pardons him for the ned. We learned a lot of things from this. Number 1. Someone asked us on the chat about the yayin ha'yitalki. So we see here, yayin ha'yitalki gets you drunk from a revi. Okay, that's the type of wine it is. Vilamanu shikor al yoreh. In other words, it must be a stronger kind of wine. He was already drunk from that. Well, whatever we already said, maybe a revi gets you drunk, or maybe more. Right, depends on levels. Vilamanu shikor al yoreh. What do you learn from here? If you're shikor, you shouldn't rule in anything. Vilamanu shederech mifigat hayayin, and we learned that walking gets rid of, makes you sober. Vilamanu she'em mifirim nidarim lo rachu v'lo ma'alech v'lo omed ela yoshev. Not while you're standing, not while you're riding, not while you're walking, but sitting. So first issue is we have to deal with why we brought this braita. This is the end of that very long braita. Katani miyat shlosha milim. Says 3 meal. So what do they say? Shani yayin ha'yitalki d'mishaker tfei. You could say the yayin ha'yitalki is more potent and you need 3 meal. That's the difference between the regular wine. Maybe that's the issue. So then they say, wait a minute, let's go back. V'hamar Rav Nachman, remember? Amar Rav Ravua lo shanu ela sheshata revi'it. Aval shata yoter mi revi'it kol shekein derech Torah d'tov v'shena mishakarto. Remember, it's worse if you're more drunk. It's bad to walk. It makes you more exhausted. And the sleep is bad for you. So now I told you, remember this from the beginning of the story? Rochev shane. Oh, he was riding. Riding is not as exhausting as walking. And since he was riding, that's why it was okay. It didn't make him tired. Okay, the fact that he went that he was riding after and not walking. Well, then they say, wait a minute. If you're already bringing up the fact that he was riding and not walking, hashadati lahachi l'rami barabanami lokashya rachuf shani. You don't even have to say it was a difference yayin ha'yitalki regular wine. You could just say he was riding, and that's why it was 3. Normal wine you need 1 meal to walk, or 3 meal if you're riding, because you need to take longer if you're not really exerting much energy. So that's how they end up resolving it. Now we're going to go back to some of the other things that were mentioned. Ini, this mifirim nidarim while you're sitting. Is that really true? Ha'amar Rav Nachman, mifirim nidarim bein mahalech, bein omed, bein rachuv. You could do it whether you're walking, whether you're sitting, whether you're walking, standing, or riding. You don't need to be sitting. So they answered Tanai, is a machloket Tanaim. And as I said with that earlier line where it could be explained in different ways, this also is a line that's explained in two different ways. Rashi and Tosfot and others disagree. Rashi and Tosfot disagree, and others kind of line up along with Rashi and Tosfot. What does sitting have to do with? Well, if you sit, if you need to focus on something, you need to sit. If you're not sitting, right, often you're in the middle of a conversation with someone. If you're standing, you're distracted. If you sit, you give someone the proper focus, you sit and you really focus. So if the Chacham really needs to focus, now why would he need to focus? So the reason, before I read it in the words, I'm going to tell you, everyone agrees the reason you would need to focus is if when you go to, the person comes and says, listen, I took a vow, I want to get rid of it. Well, Chacham said to him, why do you want to get rid of it? And he has to come up with, is it possible that maybe there has to be an element of regret, that the person regrets making the neder? The question is, does it have to be that the Chacham who's getting rid of the neder says, who's annulling the vow, says, could it be that had you known that if you said, I'm not going to eat apples, and you didn't know that your wife was baking a delicious apple pie that day, or you're not going to eat, whatever it might be, had you known that, would you have taken the vow? And then of course, no, I never would have taken the vow. So if the Chacham needs to come up with that kind of explanation, then he needs to focus and think about it to help the person out with opening up what we call a petach, an opening. So the question is, what does it mean, potchim b'charata or ein potchim b'charata? We're going to say basically, Laman damar potchim b'charata. Some people say we open with regret. That's the literal translation. And other people say ein potchim b'charata. We don't open with regret. Each is explained in the opposite way, or each one way and the opposite. Potchim b'charata could mean that he needs to open, as I said, we call it an opening. He needs to open with a reason, to give the person a reason as to why they would regret. That's potchim b'charata, according to Rashi. And ein potchim b'charata means he doesn't need to, it can be very general, like, oh, you sure you didn't really want to vow? Vows are bad, something like that. And then other people say, no, it's the opposite. Potchim b'charata means you can start already right with regret. Do you regret what you did? Yes. Okay, great. Off, got rid of your neder. But you don't need, because potchim b'charata, regret is already the later stage. First, you need the excuse, and then you get to the regret. So Tosfos says potchim b'charata means you could just start with regret. And ein potchim b'charata means you can't just start with regret. You have to come up with a reason behind it. So there's a bit of a debate about how to read this. And then that affects kind of how you read the next section, which is Amar Rabbi Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, which this actually has more important ramifications. My patach le Rabban Gamliel ahu gaver. So what did he open with? Okay, now the question is going to be, if we say he's opening in potchim b'charata, right? Is this potchim with, is really giving him a reason, or maybe this is very general and this isn't a reason at all, and we're saying he held it, you didn't, like this would be the opposite. So my patach le Rabban Gamliel ahu gavra, it's a little bit tricky if you explain it the other way, because he sat, so he did obviously have some sort of petach, but this is actually a very general petach, so it's a little tricky. Anyway, patach lahu gavra yesh bo tak kemadkerot cherev. This really literally means some people can botaz levate, to express. You can express something, say something, and you could stab someone with your words. Okay, right? Words are very dangerous. Ulashon chachamim marpeh, but if you speak properly, like the way the rabbis speak, that is healing. So now it's interesting the way, if you go earlier at the page where he said, I don't like this, right? That really was Lashon of a Chacham, and it wasn't so appropriate. But the right way to speak is not to, pierce, stab people. But the way they darshan it is, sometimes you express something, and here this is all about how vows are bad. You shouldn't make vows. Vows are bad. And then if you make vows, sometimes you could, you should really get stabbed. Shouldn't make vows. The rabbis were very against vows. We'll get all this in the Nidarim. They didn't like people having to swear off of things. It wasn't looked on respectfully in the eyes of the rabbis. But the rabbis can heal you because they can get rid of your vow. So now, don't you regret what you did, and don't you want to repeal the vow? So the simple reading is that this was his petach, liftoch b'charata. But Tosfot would have to understand this a little differently. Okay, next. Amar ve'ein mavirin ala ochlin. Now we're getting back to the food issue. Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, lo shanu ela b'dorot harishonim. This is only true in earlier generations. Now, You might say, why? Well, you'll see something interesting. In the earlier generations, there wasn't a lot of witchcraft going on. There's a lot of witchcraft going on. You should not touch food that you don't know what happened to it, because if you see a loaf of bread on the floor, it could be that there was a spell cast upon it, and that's why it's thrown on the ground, and it's there almost as a, to trip you up, and the witches want you to pick it up, and really it has a spell on it. So you should avoid picking up foods that you don't know what they are. It's very interesting. So now it's going to be even more interesting, because the question is, on what type of things do they do witchcraft on, and what don't they? Tana shlemi mavlin, ptitin e mavlin. So mavirin. So now they say, if they're whole, mavirin, then you avoid them with the 10-foot pole, because they could have sorcery attached to them. They could have been spooked. But ptitin e mavirin. But if they're pieces, then you can't just pass over them. Then you have to pick them up, because the assumption is there's no witchcraft. They don't do witchcraft on little crumbs and pieces and, not whole items. So is that really true? Amalei, we get to learn a little bit about witchcraft. Amalei Rav Asi, the Rav Ashi, Va'ptitin lo avdan, they don't do witchcraft on small pieces. V'haktiv, now of course he doesn't know witches and whether they really do it. So what does he do? He brings a verse from the Nevi'im, from Yechezkel. So, V'tichalelna oti elami b'shalei so'orim u'b'tutei lechem. It says, it's a section talking about witchcraft, and it says that they're mechalel Shem Hashem, they're disgracing me, using some barley pieces and pieces of bread, like not whole pieces of bread, but slices of bread or crumbs of bread. So here you see they're doing witchcraft, right? They're disgracing me using these little pieces. So he says to him, that doesn't teach you anything. You misunderstood the verse, or at least one can interpret the verse otherwise. Lechem deshakle ba'agrayu. No, it means they're disgracing God for their salary. They're only making such a little amount of money, getting like crumbs of bread and a little bit of barley. That's what they're getting as salary for their witchcraft, and yet they're still engaging in it and disgracing my name. So basically it's saying that has nothing to do with what they do witchcraft on. It's what they make, the money they make doing the witchcraft. Okay, so we end there with, seems like whole loaves of bread, one can't pick up off the ground, which is interesting. It's kind of counterintuitive, right? That's the most respectful thing that you should have respect for and pick up off the ground. But in their day anyway, if there's witchcraft around, obviously nowadays we don't really have this kind of thing. So seems like you would actually not be able to walk past bread, whether it's whole or part. And some people say it's only bread. Some people say this applies to any kind of food. You should really pick it up. So there's this, I just have to end with this story. There's on the corner, not far from my house. I pass it every week on the way to shul. And there's leftover, someone had takeout food and they left over all sorts of containers from it. And it's just sitting there. Like, it's disgusting. And nobody's moved it for months on end. And I'm thinking now I should probably go and move it after learning this again. So we'll see if I get up the guts to go near it. And anyway, and with that, have a good day, everybody.